The work of Carl Jung has been largely influential to our understanding of psychology. Though publicly he would deny being a prophet or mystic, there was another side to Jung which honored the spirit world and the experiences of his ancestors. To form this spiritual rebirth, however, he would depart from Freud's secular take on psychoanalysis to forge the collective unconscious, archetypes, and active imagination. Religion must replace religion, and so the spirit world would be known as the collective unconscious, and the spirits would be complexes, the largest of these being the ego. Today we explore the mystical experiences of Jung and his folk on the path to self-realization. Ancestral inheritance is the ground of subjective experience within an individual. Jung inherited the inner fatherland which would guide his existence. One of such ancestors was Carl Jung, grandfather of C.G. Jung. Carl Jung had attended national ceremonies embracing the German folk to build a sense of cultural unity among tribes from various regions in the early 1800s. These were bursts of nationalism in a confused and divided population. The feeling of being German were all one could hold on to at that point in time, for the fatherland was an ideal, not a reality yet. Songs and patriotic speeches were delivered to pledge allegiance to the group and purity of the folk. Carl Jung would regard his experiences in these ceremonies as the most important of his life. He'd received a black, red, and gold robe, which would become one of his grandson's most cherished possessions. The occupation of physician would also run down through generations of the Jung bloodline. It is also rumored that Carl Jung was an illegitimate child of Goethe. C.G. Jung marveled at the similarities between his grandfather and Goethe. Both were vital, energetic, productive, and larger than life. Whatever the case may be, C.G. Jung certainly had a great set of genes and fascinating family history. Jung is the product of the evolution and genius of his folk. On the maternal side of Carl Jung are the prize works. From this lineage he was granted the gift of second sight, or as he would call it, active imagination. Jung's maternal grandfather, Samuel Prizework, believed that Hebrew could be used to communicate with the dead, so it should be of no surprise that he was an early supporter of Zionism. Jung believed that his daughter and mother inherited psychic abilities from their grandmother. While in his medical school years, Jung thought that people could communicate with otherworldly entities. He began to wonder if there was a non-Christian, archaic spirit world, and how this could be reconciled in a Judeo-Christian civilization. Despite Carl Jung's Swiss and Christian upbringing, his Germanic identity would emerge. In 1925, Carl Jung expressed his belief in ancestral possession. Certain ancestral memories can become triggered in certain circumstances in someone's life. Someone could believe that they don't have a capacity for leadership, but then under a situation where they need those skills, they suddenly have what it takes. Jung had a personality number 1 who was of scientific nature by day. But in his mystical private life, he would be personality number 2, who is an older man of the 18th century. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he said that he viewed reincarnation with a more open perspective, but in private had believed he was a reincarnation of Goethe. Though far from resembling genetics, this was compatible with 19th century biological theories. These theories of Jung would later be known as the collective unconscious. Just as an individual has memory of their success, mistakes, struggles, and mentality, so too at a collective level do various groups have national and racial memory within them. Biology was thought to fulfill karmic fate as a member of the folk. Jung read authors such as William Crookes, J.C.F. Zollner, and others who speculated about a medium outside the boundaries of time and 3D space. They argued for survival of existence of other realities coexisting within our own. Jung, through trance induction, visited entities in the land of the dead, whom under terms such as dominance or archetypes would be the guiding force for the rest of his life. One of such forces for Jung was Philemon, which would manifest in his desire to communicate with fourth-dimensional beings. Opinions of Jung's obsessions, which set him apart from fellow students and the majority of the scientific community, were legitimized by Kant and Schopenhauer, who were major influences on the nature of the unconscious mind. A commonly held notion is that Freud was the most influential person in Jung's life before they split. Material from the archives show that the honor goes to Otto Gross, Sabina Spielrein, and Tony Wolff. Otto Gross was a colleague of Jung in the psychoanalytic movement before becoming his patient in 1908. Spielrein and Wolff were his patients before becoming Jung's lovers and collaborators. It was Jung's experiences with Gross that gave him a more polygamous attitude. In Otto Gross, Jung was able to observe his true nature. Gross was a Nietzschean who believed in free love as a means to remove the chains of civilized society. Addicted to narcotics, highly unstable, and with appalling hygiene, Jung was unable to save his soul for psychoanalysis. The sessions, however, had more of an effect on Jung than it did on Gross. The analysis was more of an exchange than a one-way street. Jung said it was one of the harshest experiences of his life, but that something in him profoundly changed. Quote, "For in Gross I discovered many aspects of my true nature, so that he often seemed like my twin brother, except for the dementia praecox." Gross had become fascinated with Johann Jacob Bachovin's theory that our distant ancestors had lived polygamously in small tribes that tended to be matriarchal. In Bachovin's theory, the first stage was heterism. Polygamy was the rule. Both genders had behaved instinctively and by modern standards primitively. There was no agriculture or social institutions. The second stage was matriarchy. Domestication of animals and agriculture appeared, along with the first social institutions. The third stage of human history is characterized by patriarchy, where intellect and rule by law exalted. The sun became the dominant symbol, such as Apollo in Greek culture. Jung and Gross considered living polygamously to unleash the ancient creative energies of the body and the unconscious. Appalled at first by the lifestyle of Gross, Jung would later advocate polygamy for the rest of his life. The repressive orthodoxies of Christianity now seemed to him the enemies of life. Jung soon learned the spiritual sacredness of sex and advised others to consider the call of the flesh. Freud saw products of the unconscious as hieroglyphs. Jung regarded them as a starting point for dialogue. For Jung, the unconscious would always be a source of higher knowledge beyond the confinement of time and space. One could establish voices and images of one's unconscious, or inner land of the dead. For the sake of his social reputation, however, the spirits would be named complexes, and the spirit world would become the unconscious. The unconscious is the title given to the home of the ancestors, inner fatherland, land of the gods. A commonly held assumption is that Freud and Jung split because of differing opinions on the libido. Upon further examination, however, we find that a likely cause of their branching actually originates along ethnic and spiritual lines. Freud was a secular Jew with an atheistical outlook. For Jung, his take on psychoanalysis was not only a science, but also a cultural and spiritual realization. He saw God not as distant or non-existent, but within us all. Sun worship of ancient peoples would be more consistent with the modern scientific world than Judeo-Christianity. This fascination with mysticism would put a strain on his relationship with Freud. As an atheist Jew, Freud saw danger in Jung's spiritualizing psychoanalysis. Though attempts were made to patch differences between the Swiss and the Viennese Jewish circles, it didn't work out. Ethnic tensions arose between the two, followed by accusations of anti-Semitism. Such tribal tendencies between Jungian and Freudian circles exist to this day. After the branching between Freud and Jung, the psychoanalytic movement polarized between Gentile and Jew, Aryan and Semite. According to Jung, the Jews were rootless and wandering, as they were of the desert, and the Aryan was surrounded by nature. Quote, "Until now I was no anti-Semite, but now I'll become one, I believe." End quote. Mithras was an ancient Iranian solar god, like Helios, and god of order, like Apollo. The symbolism of the bull slang suggests an even greater role of Mithras, ruler of the entire cosmos, powerful enough to shift the structure of the stars, constellations, and planets. What significance does the image of Mithras have to Jung and his identity? Mithras is depicted as killing the bull, thereby symbolically ending the age of Taurus, creating an existence of new cosmic phenomenon that moves the structure of the entire cosmos. Mithraic tauroctony is emphasized by Jung in a chapter of Wanlung, The Sacrifice. His interpretation was Mithras was, quote, the sacrificer and the sacrificed. It is only his animal nature that Mithras sacrifices, his instinctuality, end quote. Jung waited to write this chapter, however, because he knew that his new ideas regarding the libido would mean he would have to depart from Freud. He knew the astrological sign of Freud, born in May, was Taurus, the bull. His final break with Freud is therefore expressed with every reference of killing the bull in The Sacrifice. By 1912, Jung had convinced his Swiss and German colleagues that organic memories of ancestral impulses were more important than individual memories. He'd lost all faith in Freud as well as the Judeo-Christian God. Jung had returned to his inner fatherland, the mentality of his people. To bring about a rejuvenation of the Aryan people, Jung practiced analytical psychology as a mask of a much more archaic religion. This attitude would shape how he saw the unconscious profoundly. The unconscious was believed to be a personal warehouse of memories, and now seen as a source of ancestral desires and tendencies inherited biologically. Jung made it clear to Freud that powerful energy of life wasn't just sex drive, but as a force of nature whose currents carried spiritual longings through biology. Just as the human body is a museum of evolutionary history, so too is the human psyche. Jung's first idea of a collective unconscious came with a dream he had where the top floor was a saloon, then below was Roman types, then all the way at the bottom was a cave of primitive culture. The theory was that the brain was made up of unconscious images with a life of their own, which would explain our thoughts and feelings. It was a synthesis of psychoanalysis, evolutionary biology, archaeology, and philology. Like psychoanalysis, philologists were interested in laws of language, which show different operations of mind. Philologists believe that they were living relics in the language one spoke. Race and tribe are powerful influences produced by the unconscious. Quote, "You cannot get conscious of these unconscious facts without giving yourself to them. They form part of the ancient mysteries. In fact, it is such figures that made the mysteries." End quote. To Jung, God was in the blood, which is consistent with attitudes toward race and biology of his time. Many in German culture felt alienated from Judeo-Christianity, which had been imposed on them for centuries. Jung, feeling disillusioned, turned to transinduction and mysticism. During his altered states of consciousness, he made a descent into the land of the dead. Along the path of self-deification, Jung had met his own personal guru, Philemon, having Egyptian and Hellenistic aesthetics. Philemon was of great importance to Jung because it showed him that, quote, "There are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life," end quote. Jung was discovering a new world that existed independently of him, and discovered that he was sharing his mind with others. Quote, "It took me a long time to admit to something in myself that was not myself," end quote. Philemon told Jung he believed he was creating his thoughts, but that they were like people in a room or animals in the wild, which do not depend on him to exist. In other words, we observe such phenomena as spectators. The exploration of the unconscious was actually an age-old, timeless way of initiation to the land of the dead, one's own inner fatherland. Metaphors were used to describe theories of the other world and the collective unconscious, with its archetypes having basis in literature. Jung regarded mystical experiences as a path to individuation, which would be taught to others. Those who achieved individuation would be born into spiritually superior human beings, free from the repressions of society, and instead with a deep bond of blood and soil. Within each person of European heritage, there is a living, pre-Christian layer of the unconscious that produced religious images of the ancient Aryans. The Semitic mask removed would reveal God within. Many German-speaking peoples were seeking a cultural rejuvenation in the face of Judeo-Christian, utilitarian, and conformist society. This iron cage had to be cast off to establish a spiritual connection with nature and the cosmos. Many German youth were hiking, singing German folk songs, reading Goethe, Haeckel, and others, wearing swastika pendants and runic rings, dancing around bonfires on days of the summer solstice, and carried banners of the ancient sun wheel on them. The sun wheel can be found in the homelands of the Aryans, Iran, and especially India. It is no coincidence that Jung was obsessed with these new religious possibilities, and considered the old gods to be within us. In 1910, he wrote in his journal, quote, "We are all children of the sun. Out of its womb our planet was born. An eternal law of nature compels us to be within its sphere and influence. The immensity of space is cold, still, lifeless. Our luminous mother sun, warming and ripening our fruit, appears as the simple, true element of life. Our ancestors knew this in ancient times. Thus their justifiable joy when the sun made its slow, victorious spiral across the sky. They then remembered that all those trees which concealed their greenness in wintertime were consecrated to the god Wotan." End quote. There were also others who had a Wagnerian twist to their neo-paganism. They convinced themselves that they were chosen like the Grail Knights in Parsifal to seek and protect the Holy Grail, in this case, the purity of Aryan blood. Jung was aware of these groups, but it's unlikely he participated in them. But the participation of his associates and patients they treated is a possibility. The most intellectually gifted disciple of Jung was Constance Long. Her essays on dream interpretation, psychological types, psychology of women, and child psychology reveal an independent mind. She was naturally attracted to complex levels of human experience. The more complex, the better. To Long, Jung was a burning star on her horizon for most of the years she devoted to him. Her diary reveals her painful transformation of devotee to apostate. In 1917, Long brought out a second edition of Collected Papers on Analytical Psychology. The anthology included the essay written by Jung in 1916, published in German in 1917, in which he introduced the dominants as the gods of the unconscious. By July 1919, when Jung was visiting England, the gods would be known as the archetypes. Constance Long took notes that reveal he thought of archetypes as a function of the unconscious mind with, quote, racial memories. The symposium discussion. The collective unconscious is a psychological state. It is that which is unconscious in everybody. On the other side, there is racial memories. On the other side, images preparing our psychological future. I am sure time and space depend on archetypes. All our concepts are mythological images. All our impulses are instincts. After the First World War in 1919, a 6-week conference was held for women's physicians to discuss their experiences and solutions to problems created by the war. Only 3 women were invited from England to attend, and Constance Long was one of them. Long was uncertain of whether or not to go, and so she decided to analyze her dreams and mental imagery. The conference was a major event in the history of the women's movement, but also for the Jungian movement in the United States. Long was intrigued by the idea that men had a female component, the anima, and that women had a male component, the animus. Recognizing this would result in an improved relationship between the sexes, as well as an inner wholeness. At this conference, Long met 3 women who would be the mothers of the Jungian movement in the United States. Long, however, became an apostate. She dissociated herself with Jung and turned to the Russian guru Upensky. When Jung had heard about this, he had tried to stop it. He had cultivated a corps of physicians to rival Freud's psychoanalysis in England. The thought of losing them to a Russian horrified him. Jung warned Long that, quote, programmed teaching is a great danger. He sent her the following letter, quote, "You shall not make totems of foreign trees. No one shall keep you, else you trespass your limits. But blessed be the place where we meet the beginnings of our limitations. Beyond one's frontiers, there is nothing but illusion and mystery, because there you arrive in a country of the wrong ancestor spirits and the wrong charms. Why do you look for foreign teachings? They are poisons. They did not come out of your blood. You should be on your own feet, and you have your own rich earth below them. Why should you listen to the word of a man who is off his own soil, who is also off his own feet? Truth is a tree with roots. It is not words. Truth only grows in your own garden, nowhere else. Only feeble men eat the food of a stranger. But your people need a strong man, one who gets truth in his own roots and out of his own blood. That is good for the people, and only that. I appeal to your own natural strength. If you refuse to help, then your gods come to your help. There is still too much Christianity in that seeking a helper or a teacher somewhere. Everything must be earned." There is controversy surrounding Jung's involvement with National Socialism. For a time, he saw it as an attractive prospect for a spiritual rebirth of his folk. The flag contains a white solar disk, or mandala at center, and a swastika, the symbol of eternal and regenerative power. Jung believed the Germans to be possessed by Wotan, for too many were unconscious. Though Jung was Völkisch and perhaps anti-Semitic, there is no evidence he was a National Socialist, though he did encourage patients to be conscious of their shadow, and that if they had any anti-Jewish feelings to, quote, "Don't let it go down, because if you do, we'll all be caught in a pogrom." When Jung gave lectures to Britons and Americans, he spoke of his theories and universal values. The cataclysm of the Second World War had forced Jung to tone down his Völkisch utopianism and Aryan mysticism because such ideas were associated with the Third Reich, even though many of these ideas had a life of their own, often independent of politics before even the First World War. Jung began referring to the Swiss nationality to separate himself from the Germans, but still left little hints of his Völkisch ways. In John Jacobi's final assessment of Jung, quote, "He behaved as if his psychology were another religion."